People like to believe they're rational. We think we look at facts objectively. We think we judge situations fairly. We think our opinions are based on logic, experience, and truth. But what if your brain has been filtering reality this entire time? What if, without realizing it, you've been seeing only the evidence that supports what you already believe, while ignoring everything else? That's confirmation bias. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. In relationships, politics, social media, friendships, family arguments, dating, workplaces, even in the way you see yourself. Your brain is constantly searching for proof that your current beliefs are correct. Not because you're stupid, not because you're weak, but because the human mind hates uncertainty. And sometimes it would rather protect your existing worldview than discover the truth. Imagine this: you meet someone for the first time. Within minutes, your brain quietly forms an impression. Maybe they seem arrogant, maybe kind, maybe fake, maybe intelligent. Now here's the dangerous part. From that moment on, your brain starts collecting evidence to confirm that first impression. If you think they're arrogant, you'll notice every interruption they make. But you'll ignore the moments they're generous or insecure. If you think they're attractive and charming, you'll excuse behaviors you would normally dislike. Same actions, different interpretation. Because once the mind creates a story, it protects that story. This happens constantly. A partner forgets to text back. If you already believe they care about you, you think they're probably busy. But if you already fear abandonment, your mind says they're losing interest. The event didn't change, only the meaning did. And that meaning was chosen by your existing beliefs. That's confirmation bias. Not seeing reality as it is, but seeing reality through emotional expectations. Your brain is not designed to make you objective. It's designed to keep you psychologically stable. Humans evolved in dangerous environments. Quick judgments helped survival. If early humans constantly doubted every assumption, hesitation could be fatal. So the brain became efficient. It builds mental shortcuts, patterns, predictions, assumptions. The problem is, modern life is far more complex than survival in the wild, yet the brain still behaves as if certainty equals safety. That's why changing your mind feels uncomfortable, sometimes even painful, because beliefs become attached to identity. And when identity feels threatened, the brain reacts emotionally before logically. You can see this everywhere online. Two people can look at the exact same event and come to completely opposite conclusions. Not because one saw different facts, but because each brain filtered the facts differently. One person searches for proof they're right. The other does the same, and both feel absolutely convinced. That's what makes confirmation bias so powerful. It doesn't feel like bias. It feels like truth. Now, confirmation bias has always existed, but social media turned it into a machine. Every click teaches algorithms what you already agree with. Every video you watch, every post you like, every opinion you pause on. The system feeds you more of the same. Over time, your world becomes emotionally customized. You stop encountering challenging perspectives naturally. You live inside a psychological mirror, and slowly, your beliefs harden. Not because they're necessarily correct, but because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity feels true. That's why misinformation spreads so easily online, not because people love lies, but because people love emotional consistency. A false idea that matches your worldview feels safer than a true idea that challenges it. That's uncomfortable to admit, but it's real. And the scariest part? Intelligent people are not immune. Sometimes intelligence makes confirmation bias worse, because smart people become better at defending their beliefs, better at arguing, better at rationalizing, better at finding selective evidence, not better at seeing truth. This is where confirmation bias becomes deeply personal, especially in love. If someone secretly believes, "I'm not lovable," their brain starts searching for proof. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A small disagreement becomes evidence they'll be abandoned. Silence feels threatening. Distance feels permanent. And eventually, they may unintentionally create the very outcome they fear, not because the fear was true initially, but because the mind kept interpreting reality through pain. On the other side, someone who believes people always leave me may become hyper-vigilant, analyzing tone, reading too deeply into messages, overthinking small changes in behavior. Their nervous system stays alert for confirmation. And when you constantly search for danger, you eventually find something that looks like danger, even if it isn't. This is why unresolved emotional wounds distort perception. The brain doesn't just remember pain, it predicts it, and predictions shape interpretation. That's why two people in the same relationship can experience completely different emotional realities. One feels loved, the other feels abandoned. Same relationship, different internal filters. Confirmation bias also explains something many people struggle to understand. Why do people stay in toxic relationships? Because once the brain emotionally commits to a belief, it resists contradictory evidence. Someone may believe they love me deep down, so they minimize disrespect, excuse manipulation, ignore repeated patterns. Their mind highlights rare moments of affection while suppressing ongoing harm. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because admitting the truth would destroy the emotional story they built. And the brain fears emotional collapse. This is also why friends often fail to convince someone they're being mistreated. Outside observers see patterns clearly, but the person inside the relationship sees emotionally filtered evidence. The mind protects attachment, even unhealthy attachment, because losing hope sometimes feels more painful than enduring dysfunction. And honestly, many people listening to this have probably experienced that themselves, maybe not romantically, maybe with family, friendships, workplaces. You kept waiting for someone to become who you believed they could be, while ignoring who they consistently showed themselves to be. That's confirmation bias mixed with emotional survival. Sometimes the most dangerous confirmation bias isn't about other people, it's about you. A person who believes they're a failure notices every mistake, but ignores achievements. A person convinced they're unattractive notices every rejection, but dismisses compliments as politeness. Someone who believes they're awkward remembers every embarrassing moment for years. Meanwhile, everyone else forgot it within minutes. The brain selectively edits memory, not objectively, emotionally. And over time, repeated self-beliefs become internal reality. This is why insecurity can feel impossible to escape, because your mind becomes both the storyteller and the evidence collector. Imagine carrying a hidden belief like, "I'm not good enough." Now every setback becomes proof. Every awkward interaction becomes confirmation. Every comparison online strengthens the narrative. Eventually, the belief feels factual, even when it isn't. And this happens to more people than you realize, especially today. People are constantly comparing their real lives to curated versions of others online, which creates distorted self-perception. You see your messy reality. Compared to everyone else's edited highlights, your brain absorbs that imbalance and confirmation bias fills the gaps. See? Everyone else has it together except me. But that isn't reality. That's selective exposure shaping identity. Have you ever argued with someone and realized, no matter what evidence you show, they refuse to change their mind? There's a reason. Facts alone rarely overpower identity, especially when beliefs are emotional. If a belief becomes tied to someone's pride, community, trauma, or worldview, challenging the belief feels like a personal attack, so the brain defends itself. This is called motivated reasoning. People don't always search for truth. Sometimes they search for emotional protection. And honestly, everyone does this sometimes, even you. Even the people who think they're extremely open-minded. In fact, one of the strongest signs of confirmation bias is believing you're less biased than others. That's the trap, because the brain naturally notices bias in other people before noticing it in itself. It's easy to say they're brainwashed. Much harder to ask, what if I'm filtering reality too? That question requires humility, and humility is psychologically uncomfortable. Many adult beliefs begin in childhood. A child repeatedly criticized may unconsciously grow into an adult who expects rejection. A child ignored emotionally may become hypersensitive to distance. A child praised only for achievement may believe their worth depends on performance. These early beliefs quietly shape perception for years, sometimes decades. And because they formed early, they feel natural, invisible, like reality itself. Someone raised in chaos may feel suspicious in healthy relationships because calmness feels unfamiliar. Someone raised around emotional unpredictability may interpret stability as boredom. Again, confirmation bias reinforces the emotional blueprint. The brain searches for familiar emotional experiences, even painful ones, because familiar feels safe. That's one of the strangest truths about human psychology. People don't always choose what's healthy. They often choose what feels emotionally recognizable. Fear intensifies confirmation bias dramatically. When people are anxious, uncertain, lonely, or emotionally overwhelmed, the brain becomes threat-focused. It starts scanning for danger everywhere. That's why anxious people often misinterpret neutral situations negatively. A short reply feels cold. A facial expression feels hostile. Being left on red feels devastating. And once fear enters perception, the brain selectively notices information supporting that fear. This creates psychological loops. Fear changes interpretation. Interpretation increases fear. Then fear searches for more confirmation. And eventually, people become trapped inside mental narratives that feel impossible to escape. This is especially common in modern life because people are mentally overstimulated constantly. Too much information, too much comparison, too much outrage, too much noise. The brain becomes emotionally exhausted, and exhausted mind seeks certainty even harder. That's partly why extreme opinions spread so effectively online. Certainty feels emotionally relieving. Nuance requires energy. Being right feels good, not just emotionally, chemically. Your brain rewards certainty, especially social certainty. That's why winning arguments can feel satisfying, why validation online becomes addictive, why people surround themselves with others who reinforce their beliefs. Agreement feels safe, disagreement feels threatening, but there's a hidden danger. The more emotionally attached someone becomes to being right, the less capable they become of growth, because growth requires discomfort. It requires admitting, I may have misunderstood, I may have judged too quickly, I may not see the full picture, and that's difficult for the ego, especially in public. This is why people sometimes double down even after being proven wrong. The brain protects identity before accuracy. And honestly, social media made this worse too. Platforms reward confidence, not nuance. Quick certainty spreads faster than thoughtful complexity. So people learn to defend positions aggressively instead of exploring ideas honestly. Sometimes confirmation bias destroys relationships silently, not through dramatic conflict, but through assumptions. You assume your partner doesn't appreciate you, so you notice every missed detail. You ignore their quiet efforts. You assume your friend secretly dislikes you, so normal distance feels intentional. You stop reaching out. Then the friendship fades, and, ironically, the outcome confirms your original fear. This is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Beliefs shape behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce beliefs. And most people never realize the loop exists. They think, see, I was right, without noticing how perception influenced reality. This is one of the hardest psychological patterns to break, because once the brain emotionally commits to a narrative, it interprets almost everything through that lens. So how do you fight confirmation bias? You probably never eliminate it completely. No human does. But awareness changes everything. The first step is learning to pause before immediately trusting your interpretation, especially emotional interpretations. Ask yourself, what evidence am I ignoring? What would someone with a different perspective notice? Am I reacting to reality or to fear? Those questions matter because thoughts are not always facts. Emotions are not always accurate reflections of reality. Sometimes they're reflections of old wounds, old conditioning, old survival patterns. Another important skill is tolerating uncertainty. Most people rush toward conclusions because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. But mature thinking requires psychological flexibility. Sometimes the truth is, you don't fully know, and that's okay. You also need people around you who challenge you honestly, not people who blindly validate everything. Real growth often comes from discomfort, from hearing perspectives that force self-reflection, not just reinforcement. And maybe most importantly, learn to separate identity from belief. Changing your mind does not mean you're weak. It means you're capable of learning. That's strength. There's usually a moment when people first recognize confirmation bias in themselves, and it's uncomfortable. Maybe they realize someone they judged unfairly was actually kind. Maybe they notice how anxiety distorted a relationship. Maybe they understand their insecurity shaped years of self-perception. That realization can feel almost surreal, like waking up from a mental script you didn't know you were following, because once you notice the filter, you can never fully unsee it again. You start catching your assumptions faster. You become slower to judge, more curious, less emotionally reactive, and strangely, life becomes calmer. Not because uncertainty disappears, but because you stop treating every thought as absolute truth. There's usually a moment when people first recognize confirmation bias in themselves, and it's uncomfortable. Maybe they realize someone they judged unfairly was actually kind. Maybe they notice how anxiety distorted a relationship. Maybe they understand their insecurity shaped years of self-perception. That realization can feel almost surreal, like waking up from a mental script you didn't know you were following, because once you notice the filter, you can never fully unsee it again. You start catching your assumptions faster. You become slower to judge, more curious, less emotionally reactive, and strangely, life becomes calmer. Not because uncertainty disappears, but because you stop treating every thought as absolute truth. Now, hearing all this might sound unsettling, like your brain can't be trusted at all. But confirmation bias isn't proof your mind is broken. It's proof your mind is human. The brain constantly tries to create stability, predictability, meaning. The problem is simply that emotional protection sometimes distorts perception, and understanding that gives you power, because awareness creates distance. Instead of automatically believing every fear, every assumption, every interpretation, you start observing them, questioning them. That space between thought and reaction changes everything. It improves relationships, communication, self-awareness, emotional maturity, even empathy. Because once you realize your own mind filters reality, you become less arrogant about other people's perspectives too. You understand how easily humans misunderstand each other, not always from malice, but from invisible psychological filters. So the next time you feel absolutely certain about someone or yourself, pause for a moment, ask, am I seeing reality clearly? Or am I only seeing what my brain expects to see? Because sometimes the biggest illusion isn't the world around you. It's the story your mind keeps repeating inside your head. And the moment you learn to question that story, you begin to see yourself and everyone else more honestly, maybe for the first time.